It was a sunny day, and I was sitting in my office, trying to focus on work. My phone rang, and I answered absent-mindedly, expecting it to be a colleague or a client. But it was my mother on the other end, and I could hear the tremble in her voice. "Sarah, it's your mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "It's your brother," she said, her voice breaking. "He's gone." I couldn't comprehend what she was saying.
"What do you mean, gone?" "He's dead, Sarah. He died in a car accident last night." The news hit me like a ton of bricks. My brother, my only older sibling, was gone. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened as my mother continued to talk.
"He left everything to you, Sarah. All of his estate is yours."
I was stunned. All of his estate. That was worth millions. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or guilty, but before I could process it all, my mother interrupted my thoughts.
"We're planning the funeral for next week. Sarah, can you come home?" "I'll be there," I said, my mind racing with thoughts of my brother and the estate. When I hung up the phone, I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. My brother, the one person I thought would always be there, was gone, and now I had to deal with the aftermath, including the sudden inheritance of his estate.
I picked up the phone again and called my husband. "Honey, what's wrong?"
he asked, sensing my distress.
"It's my brother," I said, my voice shaking. "He's dead. He left everything to me." "Oh my God, Sarah, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice full of concern.
"I don't know what to do," I said, feeling overwhelmed. "Take a deep breath, Sarah. We'll get through this together. I'm here for you." His words comforted me, and I knew that no matter what happened, I had my husband by my side. But the thought of dealing with my brother's death and the sudden inheritance was still overwhelming.
I knew that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine.
A few days after my brother's death, my mother called to tell me that my other brother, James, had arrived in town. James and I hadn't spoken in over 10 years, and I didn't know why he was suddenly interested in our family again. "I don't want to see him," I said to my mother over the phone. "He abandoned us, remember?" "I know, Sarah, but he's your brother. He wants to pay his respects to your brother and the family," my mother said, her voice pleading.
I sighed. "Fine, I'll come to the funeral, but I don't want to talk to him."
The day of the funeral arrived, and I stood at the back of the church, watching as people filed in. I spotted James from a distance, and I felt a pang of anger and resentment. He looked the same as he had 10 years ago, tall and muscular, with short hair and a chiseled jawline. As the funeral began, James sat a few rows ahead of me, and I could feel his gaze on me. I ignored him, focusing instead on the eulogy being given by my brother's closest friend. After the service ended, I headed out of the church, eager to leave and go back home. But as I stepped outside, James approached me. "Sarah, can we talk?" he said, his voice tentative. I glared at him. "What do you want, James?" "I just wanted to pay my respects to our brother," he said, his voice softening. "And I wanted to talk to you about the estate." I felt a knot form in my stomach.
"What about it?"
"I think I deserve a share," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "After all, I am his brother too." I was stunned.
"Are you serious? You haven't been a part of this family in over 10 years, and now you want a piece of the estate?"
"I'm not asking for much, Sarah. Just what's rightfully mine," James said, his tone firm. I shook my head, feeling anger and frustration bubbling up inside me. "You have no right to any of it. You weren't there for him when he was alive, so why should you get anything now that he's gone?" "Because he was my brother too," James said, his voice rising, "and I deserve a share just as much as you do." I could feel my blood boiling.
"No, James, you don't deserve anything, and you won't be getting anything."
We stood there in silence for a moment, staring at each other, and then James turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat.
I watched him go, feeling a sense of triumph mixed with sadness. My brother was gone, and now I had to deal with the fallout of his death and the fight over his estate. It was a burden I never expected to bear, but I knew I had to be strong and fight for what was rightfully mine.
A few days after the funeral, I received a letter from James's lawyer requesting a meeting to discuss the division of my brother's estate. I was furious that James had gone behind my back and hired a lawyer without even discussing it with me first. I reluctantly agreed to the meeting, and we scheduled it for the following week. As I drove to the law office, my mind raced with thoughts of what James could possibly want from the estate.
I knew he had no claim to it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was up to something.
When I arrived at the office, I was greeted by James's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor. "Miss Smith, thank you for coming," he said, extending his hand. I shook it reluctantly. "Let's just get this over with, shall we?" He led me to a conference room, where James was already seated at the head of the table. He looked up as I entered, his face unreadable. "Hello, Sarah," he said, nodding at me. "James," I said curtly, taking a seat across from him. The lawyer began to speak, outlining James's proposal for the division of the estate. I listened with growing anger as he suggested that James receive a share of the property despite having no legal claim to. "I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous," I said, interrupting him. "James has no right to any of this. It's all legally mine." "Sarah, please," James said, his voice calm. "Can't we just come to some sort of agreement? We're family, after all." I scoffed. "You lost the right to call yourself family when you left us, James. You have no claim to any of this." The lawyer cleared his throat. "I understand that emotions are running high, but let's try to keep this civil, shall we?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. "Fine, but I'm not giving up any of the estate. It's all mine, legally and morally." James leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Sarah, you don't understand. I need this money. I'm in debt, and I have a family to support. Please, can't we work something out?" I shook my head, feeling a pang of guilt mixed with my anger. "I'm sorry, James, but I can't help you. You made your choices, and now you have to deal with the consequences." The meeting continued for several more hours, with James and his lawyer making various offers and proposals. But in the end, I stood firm, refusing to budge on my claim to the estate. As I left the law office, I felt a sense of relief mixed with sadness. The fight with James was far from over, but at least for now I had stood up for myself and my brother's memory. It was a small victory, but one that I knew would mean everything in the long run. After the contentious meeting with James and his lawyer, I knew I needed to hire a lawyer of my own to protect my claim to my brother's estate. I spent several days researching local attorneys and eventually settled on a small firm run by a man named Michael. I scheduled a meeting with him at his office, hoping he could help me navigate the complicated legal process of retaining my brother's assets. When I arrived at his office, I was greeted by a young woman who led me to a small conference room. A few minutes later, Michael entered, a tall man with graying hair and a warm smile. "Miss Smith, thank you for coming in," he said, shaking my hand. "Please, call me Sarah," I replied, taking a seat across from him. "So, Sarah, what can I help you with?" he asked. I took a deep breath, feeling nervous. My brother recently passed away, and I inherited his estate. But now my estranged brother has come back into the picture, claiming he has a right to some of it. I need help protecting my claim. Michael nodded, looking sympathetic. "I'm sorry for your loss, but we can definitely help you with that. Do you have any documentation regarding your brother's estate?" I handed him the papers I'd received from James's lawyer, and he began to review them. As he read through the documents, he frowned. "This is a tricky situation," he said, looking up at me. "It's possible that James could have a claim to some of the estate, depending on the circumstances of his leaving. But we can definitely fight it in court if that's what you want to do." I nodded, feeling determined. "I want to fight for what's rightfully mine. My brother worked hard for this estate, and I won't let James take any of it." Michael smiled. "I admire your determination, Sarah. We'll do everything we can to protect your claim. It won't be an easy fight, but with our experience and your passion, I think we can come out on top." Over the next few weeks, Michael and his team worked tirelessly on my case, gathering evidence and building a solid defense for my claim to the estate. It was a difficult process, with many setbacks and obstacles, but I knew that Michael was the best person to have on my side. As the court date approached, I felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. I knew that the fight with James was far from over, but with Michael by my side, I felt confident that I could come out victorious. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves as I made my way to the courthouse. Michael and his team had prepared me for what to expect, but I couldn't help feeling anxious about facing my estranged brother in court. When I arrived, Michael was already there, waiting for me outside the courtroom. "Are you ready for this, Sarah?" he asked, looking at me with concern. "I think so," I replied, taking a deep breath. "I just want this to be over." As we entered the courtroom, I was struck by how imposing and formal it all felt. The judge sat on a raised platform at the front of the room, and James and his lawyer were seated at a table across from us. The proceedings began, and James's lawyer presented his case. He argued that James had a right to a portion of the estate because of his close relationship with my brother, and that I was not the sole rightful heir. Michael countered their argument with a compelling defense, presenting evidence that my brother had explicitly stated in his will that I was to inherit his entire estate. He also pointed out that James had not been in contact with my brother for over a decade and had no valid claim to any of his assets. As the arguments continued, the tension in the courtroom grew palpable. I could feel James's eyes on me, and I knew he was angry and resentful. At one point, the judge interrupted the proceedings. "Miss Smith, can you clarify something for me?" he asked, looking at me.
"Yes, Your Honor," I replied, feeling a surge of nerves. "Why did your brother leave everything to you and not split it between both of his siblings?" the judge asked.
I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. My brother and I were very close. He knew how hard I had worked to support him in his final days, and he trusted me to carry out his wishes.
James snorted derisively, causing a stir in the courtroom. "That's ridiculous," he said loudly. "My brother would never have trusted her with everything. She's just trying to take what's mine." Michael quickly jumped in to counter James's outburst. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Ms. Smith is the rightful heir to her brother's estate. James has no valid claim, and we ask that the court rule in her favor." After several more hours of arguments and testimony, the judge finally made his ruling. "I find that Miss Sarah Smith is the sole rightful heir to her brother's estate, and that James has no valid claim to any of the assets."
I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling an immense weight lift off my shoulders. James looked furious, but I didn't care. I had fought for what was rightfully mine and had come out victorious. As we left the courthouse, Michael patted me on the back. "Congratulations, Sarah! You did it," he said with a smile.
I smiled back at him, feeling grateful for his support throughout the entire process. "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied.
We walked out of the courthouse together, feeling relieved and victorious. I knew that James might continue to be a thorn in my side, but for now I could enjoy the fact that I had successfully defended my claim to my brother's estate. After the court ruling in my favor, James didn't take the news well. He continued to send me angry texts and phone calls, demanding that I share the inheritance with him. I consulted with Michael, and we decided to take legal action to ensure that James would leave me alone. We filed a restraining order against him, which was granted by the court. Despite the restraining order, James continued to try to contact me. He even showed up at my house uninvited, causing me to feel uneasy and unsafe. I knew I had to take further action, so I decided to file a lawsuit against him for harassment and trespassing. Michael and I worked together to build a strong case against James, and we were confident in our chances of winning. The day of the verdict arrived, and I once again found myself in a courtroom. This time, James was the defendant, and I was the plaintiff. As I took the stand to testify, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. I recounted the incidents of harassment and trespassing and how they had caused me emotional distress and anxiety.
James's lawyer tried to argue that his behavior was a result of his grief and frustration at not receiving any of the inheritance, but Michael was quick to point out that there was no excuse for his actions.
As the judge deliberated, I couldn't help but feel anxious. I wanted justice to be served, but I also didn't want to drag this out any longer than necessary.
Finally, the judge returned with his verdict. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony presented, "I find in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Sarah Smith," he announced.
I felt a sense of relief wash over me, knowing that James would finally be held accountable for his actions. As we left the courthouse, Michael turned to me with a smile.
"Congratulations, Sarah! You did it again," he said.
I grinned back at him, feeling proud of myself for standing up to my brother and fighting for my rights. "Thank you for everything, Michael," I replied. Despite the difficult journey, I felt a sense of closure and peace, knowing that justice had been served. After the verdict was announced, I finally felt a sense of closure. James was no longer a threat to me, and I could finally move on with my life.
However, the aftermath of the lawsuit wasn't easy. James was still my brother, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness and guilt over the situation.
I tried to reach out to him, but he refused to respond. It seemed as though our relationship was irreparably damaged. One day, a few weeks after the verdict, I received a letter in the mail from James. I opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Inside, I found a handwritten note. Sarah, I'm sorry for the way I behaved. I know I was out of line, and I regret causing you so much pain. I hope that we can find a way to move past this and rebuild our relationship. Love, James. I was surprised by the letter, but also relieved. It seemed as though James was finally willing to take responsibility for his actions and try to make amends. I called Michael to discuss the situation. What should I do? I asked him.
Well, it's up to you, he replied. But if you're willing to forgive him and try to rebuild your relationship, then I think that's a positive step forward. I thought about it for a while and eventually decided to reach out to James. We met up for coffee and had a long conversation about everything that had happened.
It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was necessary. We both apologized for our actions and expressed a desire to move forward. I know I can't undo what I did, James said, but I hope that we can put this behind us and start fresh. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief. I hope so too, I replied. Over the next few months, James and I slowly began to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension and awkwardness, but we were making progress.
Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that the experience had taught me a lot about myself. I had learned to stand up for myself and fight for what was right, even in the face of adversity.
And although the process was difficult, it was ultimately worth it. I had gained a newfound sense of strength and confidence and had shown myself and others that I was capable of overcoming any challenge that came my way. As I reflected on my journey, I realized that I had truly come out stronger on the other side.